You walk into your bathroom after a few humid days, and there it is. That smell. Something is growing in the grout, and you haven't even noticed the leak yet. You wipe it down, open a window, move on with your day. It's a minor annoyance, a 5-minute fix. Now, imagine that smell is your entire world, and there's no window to open. Picture a settlement on a river bank, somewhere in a temperate forest, 12,000 years ago. 3 weeks into a rainy season that refuses to break. The ground has stopped being ground. It's mud now, ankle deep in places, swallowing footprints, swallowing tools if you set them down for too long. Everything you own that isn't stone is quietly rotting. Your food is rotting, your bedding is rotting, and somewhere downstream, the water you've been drinking has started making people sick. This is the part of ancient rain survival that almost never gets told. It's not really a story about cold, although cold mattered. It's a story about decay, and about a species that had to figure out, without germ theory, without so much as a word for bacteria, how to keep itself alive inside a world actively trying to rot around it. Start with the ground itself, because the ground was often the first thing to turn against you. Sustained rain doesn't just make soil wet, it changes its structure entirely. Riverbanks slump. Hillsides that seemed stable for years can suddenly let go, sending a slurry of mud and rock downhill with almost no warning. Archaeological sites across Europe and Asia occasionally reveal the aftermath of exactly this. Campsites and shelters buried under sudden slope failures. A reminder that choosing where to settle was never just about staying dry. It was about staying on ground that would still be there in the morning. The climate historian Brian Fagan, who has spent decades studying how prehistoric societies responded to shifting weather patterns, has argued that this kind of terrain literacy, knowing which slopes held and which ones didn't, was one of the quiet, unglamorous skills that separated groups who persisted for generations from those who vanished from the record entirely. Then, there's the water itself, which sounds strange to say, since water is the one thing you'd think wouldn't be scarce during a flood. But standing water and contaminated water are not the same as clean water. Heavy sustained rain moves waste, animal carcasses, and decomposing plant matter into the same rivers and pools that a group depends on for drinking. Modern outbreaks of waterborne illness spike after major flooding for exactly this reason, and there's no evidence that ancient rivers were any gentler about it. The paleopathologist Charlotte Roberts, whose research examines disease patterns in ancient skeletal remains, has noted that gut infections and parasitic loads in prehistoric populations were almost certainly influenced by seasonal water quality, not just diet. Ancient humans didn't need to understand microbiology to develop a working solution. Groups that survived tended to draw drinking water from moving sources rather than still ones, from upstream rather than downstream of a settlement, and from points as far from waste and burial areas as the terrain allowed. That's not folklore. That's applied epidemiology, arrived at through trial, error, and an enormous number of people who got it wrong before others learned from them. Food posed its own version of the same problem. In dry conditions, meat and plant matter can be preserved through simple drying. Rain removes that option entirely. Damp meat doesn't dry, it ferments, and fermentation can go two very different directions, one of them edible, one of them dangerous. Some archaeological evidence suggests ancient groups deliberately used smoke, not just for flavor or preservation in the way we think of it now, but because smoke actively discourages the mold and bacteria that thrive in the exact damp warmth a rainy season produces. Meat hung over a low, constant smolder inside a shelter wasn't only being kept dry, it was being kept in an environment hostile to rot, worked out through repetition, long before anyone understood why it worked. Shelter design followed the same underlying logic, and this is where you start to see real, deliberate engineering. In several well-studied Ice Age sites, structures weren't built flush against the ground. They were raised, even slightly, on platforms of packed earth, brush, or stone, lifting sleeping areas above the layer where water pooled and where cold, damp air settled overnight. Some sites show shallow trenches dug around the perimeter of a shelter, functioning as rudimentary drainage, channeling runoff away from the living space instead of letting it collect beneath sleeping bodies. None of this required literacy or mathematics. It required watching where the water went after the last storm, and building differently the next time. The archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef, known for his work on the deep prehistory of the Near East, described this kind of incremental architectural problem-solving as one of the clearest windows we have into ancient practical intelligence. precisely because it left almost no dramatic trace. No one remembers a trench. Everyone remembers a spear point, but the trench is often what kept the group alive long enough to need the spear again in the morning. Even the human body was, in its own way, fighting the same rot. Skin that stays wet for extended periods breaks down. Immersion-related skin conditions, sometimes described in modern military and outdoor medicine as trench foot-type injuries, don't require freezing temperatures, just sustained dampness against skin for long enough. Ancient humans without waterproof footwear would have been exposed to exactly this risk during a prolonged wet season, and the evidence suggests they responded the way most durable solutions get discovered, by paying close attention to what happened to the people who didn't rotate dry materials against their skin and copying whoever stayed healthiest. Here's the genuine twist in all of this, though. Rain wasn't purely the enemy, it was also, quietly, a resource. Sustained moisture is exactly what certain plant fibers need to become workable. Retting, the process of soaking plant stems until the fibers loosen from the woody core, happens naturally during long wet seasons, and it's the same basic process still used today to produce fiber from flax and similar plants. There's a reasonable case that ancient humans first noticed usable plant fiber, not by deliberately soaking anything, but by finding stems that had been sitting in wet ground for weeks, and discovering they came apart differently than dry ones did. Rain, the same force rotting their food, was simultaneously breaking down raw plant material into something closer to cordage. Nothing about that was designed. It was noticed, tested, and eventually repeated on purpose. All of it points toward the same underlying truth. Surviving a genuinely long rainy season wasn't really about outlasting a single dramatic threat. It was about managing a dozen small, unglamorous forms of decay simultaneously for weeks, without the ability to simply wait it out indoors. Rotting food, contaminated water, failing ground, softened skin, mold creeping into stored materials. None of these kill you the way a predator does, fast and obvious. They kill you slowly, cumulatively, through 100 small failures that stack on top of each other if nobody in the group is paying attention. And someone was always paying attention. That's really the entire story. Every solution described here, the raised sleeping platforms, the drainage trenches, the upstream drinking sites, the smoke-cured meat, was invisible to whoever wasn't looking for it and completely obvious to whoever had lived through the alternative. That knowledge moved the same way almost all deep survival knowledge moves. From someone who suffered the consequence to someone who was taught how to avoid it before they ever had to. You still live inside the descendants of those solutions. Even if you never think about it, your plumbing exists because someone eventually formalized the idea of keeping drinking water separate from wastewater. Your foundation is raised off bare soil because someone, a very long time ago, learned what happens to a structure that isn't. Your refrigerator does, chemically, roughly the same job smoke did around a low fire thousands of years earlier, just faster and with less effort on your part. So the next time you catch that smell of damp creeping into a corner of your home, and you reach for a cloth and a window latch without a second thought, remember that the fix used to be much harder than that. It used to require reading the ground, the water, and the sky all at once, and getting it right often enough, for long enough, that the knowledge survived to reach you. That smell isn't new. It's one of the oldest problems your species ever solved. You just don't have to solve it from scratch anymore.